Hi and welcome to another episode of Research in Profile, brought to you by the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. My name is Dr. Seb Kaempf, and I'm joined here by three wonderful researchers we have in the school, and in particular in the Asia-Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect. So on the very far side is Eglantine Staunton, who recently finished her PhD thesis in the school. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Then we've got Professor Alex Bellamy, who is the director of the center. And then we've got Dr. Sarah Teitt, who is the deputy director in the center here at University of Queensland. You guys are all featuring in a major new handbook entitled the Oxford Handbook of the Responsibility to Protect, which has come out in 2016. It is edited by Alex Bellamy and Tim Dunne. And we wanted to invite you to find out more about this book, what the motivation was behind the book, and then dive deep into some of those issues and chapters that you guys have written in that. So I will start with one of the editors here, Alex. Alex, the doctrine of responsibility to protect the norm or the regime was officially endorsed by the Global Summit at the United Nations in 2005. Now, roughly a decade later, this major handbook is being published. What were the motivations you guys had to publish this book?
Well, it's precisely the 10th anniversary. Those 10 years of practice and implementation give us something to look at. So, as you say, member states agreed to R2P, Responsibility to Protect, back in 2005. Since then, they've been working on implementing that and building institutional capacity at the UN and in regional organizations, as well as trying to implement this principle in hard cases like Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, South Sudan, the Congo. So we thought the 10th anniversary was a good time to kind of take a step back and take stock of the normative progress, the institutional progress, and how R2P is working in the field, and to try and do that in a kind of one-stop shop, bring it all together into one place to consolidate the best research on R2P right now.
And it's in a way the who is who in R2P research, an impressive list. It's a really thick book when you look at it. And the structure kind of reflects what you've just been talking about. I find it quite interesting. You know, you divided the different sections of the book into history, into theory, United Nations order, and cross-cutting issues. And on top of that, provided for 12 in-depth case studies and an outlook into the future. And what was the reasoning behind that structure? And could you please talk us very briefly, in a way, through the entire volume to give us a bit of a Reader's Digest overview?
Sure. Well, as you say, it's a big volume. It comes in at over 1,000 pages with 53 chapters. And you said there are a range of different sorts of authors in there, everything from former foreign ministers like Lloyd Axworthy, who was the man who actually initiated the whole responsibility to protect concept, through to people like Gareth Evans, former Australian foreign minister who led the charge in persuading the world to support R2P, to several senior UN officials, to leading researchers in the field, and as well some of the kind of dynamic and vibrant young researchers in the field. And this is one of the key parts of the story of R2P, is this kind of proliferation of exciting new research. And we wanted to capture both the old hands, if you like, and the people who have things to tell about the story, and there are things about the story of R2P's evolution that haven't been told before that are in this book, but also new and dynamic research about parts of the world and institutions that haven't yet been well covered. And that was the thinking behind the structure of the book as well. So we wanted to firstly provide an overview of the evolution of the concept, but also locate it in international relations theory, and also think about some of the normative implications. So this is the first parts of the book are all about that, taking a step back and reviewing sort of 10 years since the World Summit, and there was 10 years prior to the World Summit of dialogue and negotiation around responsibility to protect, and to locate that within broader trends in world politics. So that's the first two parts of the book, looking at the history and the theory. Then the next two parts are looking at the kind of institutional development of R2P. So what institutions have been built, what capacities have been built within the UN, within regional organizations, and what are the different regional perspectives on a responsibility to protect. although a normative consensus has been reached globally, that doesn't mean that everyone thinks the same thing. There are differences of interpretation, differences of focus and priority. So the next two sections are looking at those institutional developments, both in the UN and regional organizations, but also regional attitudes towards R2P, which are, of course, quite different. Then the final two sections look at, firstly, how R2P intersects with other similar agendas in the kind of human security or human protection space. So things like women, peace, and security, things like the protection of civilians in armed conflict, things like peace building. And there a common theme has been that for the past 10 years, we've tended to operate in different spaces. So we have a literature and a practice of peace building, and we have a literature and a practice on R2P. But actually, these share much in common, and what we need to do is start talking across agendas much more. And that's a kind of key theme that comes out from a lot of the chapters in that section that could be carried forward. And then, as you say, the next section is a series of case studies, and we've done 12 case studies. There's actually some cases that we could have included that we didn't, simply for space reasons. But those are really important, because it's one thing to have an international principle and build institutions. It's another thing entirely to put this to work in practice. And of course, in each situation is full of its own particularities, its own context, its own politics. And so we wanted to show the different ways in which the rubber hits the road, if you like, in cases as different as South Sudan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Then the very final section, we gather some of the kind of the old hands, the grandees of the responsibility to protect, and we simply ask them to look at the next 10 years. What are the challenges that are going to have to be overcome if we're going to turn the responsibility to protect from a nice principle and idea into a kind of a daily lived reality for people on the ground?
Wow. Very impressive, as a Reader's Digest overview, talking through over 1,000 pages of an edited volume. And of course, each of you has written a separate chapter in a different section. So Eglantine has written her chapter together with Tim Dunne in the history section of the book. Sarah has written her chapter in the global perspectives of the book, and Alex has written his chapter in the UN order section of the book. And so I want to now go a bit deeper into each of those respective chapters, and like to start Eglantine, start in the chronological order of the book. So we start with Eglantine and the history section. Co-edited with Tim Dunne, your chapter is called The Genocide Convention and Cold War Humanitarian Intervention. And in that chapter, you and Tim Dunne argue against the kind of conventional interpretation that at the end of the Cold War, we have seen or witnessed a significant rupture in the evolution of the norm of humanitarian intervention. In a way, that's the kind of conventional wisdom out there in the literature. You argue slightly differently and argue that we need to modify this particular view. So I'd like to ask you to explain both the conventional understanding that existed and how you guys suggest we should modify that particular view.
Of course. So as you mentioned, the chapter Tim Dunne and I co-wrote is investigating the efforts made by the international community in terms of human protection during the Cold War. And as you mentioned, we begin with the conventional account. And the key argument these authors make is that the 1990s is a key turning point, if not the key turning point, in terms of the emergence of human protection norms or standards and expectation. On the other hand, the Cold War is often seen as being characterized by the predominance of order over justice, since the norm of non-intervention prevailed over the norm of human rights. These kinds of claims are made on the basis that there was a weak institutionalization of human protection treaties. Additionally, because of the norm of non-intervention, even when there were interventions that did have humanitarian effects and that did occur without the host state consent, they were never justified using humanitarian claims. So, for instance, we investigate the intervention of India in Pakistan in 1971, of Vietnam in Cambodia in 1978, and of Tanzania in Uganda in 78-79. And all of these interventions did have considerable humanitarian effects, but none of them were justified or even understood as being humanitarian, because the intervening states justified them using the self-defense rhetoric. So from this, we argue that a lot of these arguments that were brought forward by the conventional accounts are not wrong per se, but Tim and I suggest that they need to be nuanced in order to take into account the development of standards and expectation around responsible sovereignty that occurred during the Cold War. So while it is true to claim that states were indeed reluctant to modify the norm of non-intervention, it was also the case that there was a consolidation of social norms of protection. And these social norms did impact states throughout the Cold War. So to give you an example that we develop in the chapter, we build from the work of Karen Smith, and we investigate the social character of the Genocide Convention. And we argue that despite the legal shortfalls of the convention, a lot of states were influenced by the Genocide Convention, even though they were reluctant to acknowledge their responsibilities in terms of prevention of genocide and the prosecution of perpetrators. So from that, we argue that the turning point thesis needs to be reconsidered. And what we mean by that is that the transition towards the emergence of human protection norm, which is often associated with the 1990s, actually began during the Cold War. In other words, the emergence of human protection norms in the 1990s should not be seen as a transformation, but rather as the development of the moral purpose of states.
Great. And you already hinted in your last few sentences at that, but I'd like to ask you to tease this out a bit more, namely that, what implications do the findings of your chapter have on the way in which we understand the responsibility to protect?
Great, yeah. So there's a lot of literature out there on R2P and human protection norms already, but a majority of the literature focuses on really the transition from the 1990s to the 2005 World Summit. And even though there are some great literature that use a broader historical framework, the Cold War is often overlooked. So by focusing on the legal power of norms, by focusing less, on the legal power of norms and more on their social character, we provide a more nuanced approach in order to show that standards and expectation around responsible sovereignty did evolve during the Cold War. So with this nuanced approach, we're hoping to provide a better understanding of human protection norms such as R2P by showing that the Cold War is a really important chapter in the broad history of the emergence of these norms.
Okay, thank you. We go now from Eglantine's chapter in the history section to Sarah Teitt's chapter, which is in the global perspective section of the handbook. Sarah, you look into Southeast Asia and South Asia, and your chapter begins with an interesting paradox that on the one hand you observe that these regions, particularly the Asia-Pacific region, for all sorts of reasons might not have been the most fertile ground for anchoring this new norm of civilian protection, preventing atrocity crimes, and so on. And yet, at the same time, in 2005, members of this particular region, with the exception of North Korea, all signed up to the R2P norm. How can we explain that? So maybe what I want to ask you is, talk us through that paradox and explain it to us.
Sure. I mean, the overarching premise of the chapter is that we see in the Asia Pacific a region that doesn't necessarily have what we would see as self-evident norms that can anchor R2P. I talk about strong preoccupation with non-interference, strong focus on centralized government and state sovereignty, weak institutional mechanisms for the protection of human rights, and yet, as you said, there's all these states in the region endorsed R2P in 2005, and I should add subsequently have offered their support for the principle. And so the question isn't just a 2005 moment, it's how do we explain 2005, and also how do we see the last decade, the trajectory since then. And in international relations scholarship, or in the scholarship on R2P, there's a tendency to look at this as a story of norm containment. And so through the process wherein R2P was introduced in 2001, then later endorsed in 2005, and then on to the Secretary General's reports from 2009, this narrative goes that we see a process by which Asia-Pacific powers, and often the focus is on India and China, but there's an idea that states with a strong preoccupation with sovereignty and a non-interference pushed back on the normative prescriptions of R2P in a way that weakened or diluted this principle in a manner which could be compatible with the region's security norms. My chapter seeks to tell a different story. I don't accept norm containment as the totality of the story of how Asia-Pacific states have come to endorse R2P. The story that I tell is a story in which it's closer mirroring Amitav Acharya's idea of norm circulation, where we see a process of norm contestation that's limiting the scope and limiting the application at times of the norm, but it's also doing it in a way that you see greater compliance pool for states that are contesting. And in looking at it through that lens, the story of norm containment becomes less salient than a story in which Asia-Pacific states, through iterative contestation, have changed the scope and sometimes meaning and application of R2P in a way that we see the anchors in the region. And so I walk through 5 channels of influence in the chapter. Those 5 channels of influence are, some of them are the contestation on the part of the agency of Asia-Pacific states. Some of them are receptiveness on behalf of norm entrepreneurs, of understanding of what type of arguments would find resonance in the region. But those 5 channels of influence look at the shift from sovereignty to against human rights to sovereignty as responsibility. This has been something that appears in much of the R2P literature, but is still nevertheless an important factor to take into consideration. And I use as an example in the chapter Chinese scholars who, China has launched some of the most principled defenses of sovereignty in saying that sovereignty and human rights are intertwined commitments. And so we see throughout the 1990s examples of the most vociferous arguments against humanitarian intervention or even human protection more generally coming from China as a defense of sovereign rights as a human right. And yet what R2P language opened up was for Chinese scholars to, we see this in Chinese literature now, of mapping responsibility to protect onto the idea of mandate of heaven, and saying that there was a long history in China of this idea that the right to govern was conditioned on the treatment of populations, so that you have opening conversations with Chinese analysts of saying, this isn't alien to your principles, these aren't alien ideas in this context. That's just one of them. The next sort of 4 channels of influence that I look at are this idea of sovereignty, of R2P as an ally of sovereignty, and that this marriage of human rights and sovereignty fits well with a long tradition of security norms in the Asia-Pacific region. And I use as an example the high-level advisory panel on R2P, which in Southeast Asia, which was chaired by Dr. Surin Pitsawan, the former Secretary General of ASEAN, who maps out how the principles of R2P resonate with the existing mechanisms, institutions in ASEAN. And that's just to say that part of that was made possible for this idea that it's an ally of sovereignty, not antagonistic to it. And then the other 3 channels, I won't go into too many details, but that's just say that it conforms to international law and doesn't alter the UN Charter, that it adopts a much more comprehensive and broader approach to the problem of atrocities prevention that resonates with some of the human security norms that generated in the Asia-Pacific region. So although I point out that of course this is dealing with the very pointy end of a freedom from fear agenda, that's what the prevention and response to atrocities is, we're also dealing with, when the Secretary talks about a narrow but deep approach, looking at a much broader agenda that resonates with Asia-Pacific ideas of root causes. For so long they've talked about we can't just address, we can't, at the moment at the cliff's edge. We have to look at the broader and deeper agenda of sustainable development, capacity building efforts. And finally, the last point I look at is what Ed Luck, the former special advisor on the Response to Protect, talked about. He said that this was going to be a marathon, not a race. He said that the implementation of R2P would fit with the pace of change that is comfortable to the UN. What he was making sure is that we're bringing countries on board, but we're still challenging them to the aspirations of this project. And that language and the outreach in the Asia-Pacific region of attempting to say that we understand the attempt isn't that we know that this norm is going to be used right away, right now, but that we see this as an institutionalization process, that it is going to go through incremental change, that it's going to come at a pace where we can think about a ongoing project of implementation that is consistent with the norms and practices, norms and security practices and policy change in this region.
Great. And you also empirically engage in these kinds of questions, and you examine how the norm of the responsibility to protect became not only accepted but then affirmed by two particular actors, namely India and Japan. One might be an obvious choice, the other one surprised me. So I want to ask you, like, why did you pick these particular two actors? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about how that story of accepting an affirmation worked in both cases.
Sure, I'm interested to know which one surprised you. I think that, well, China is an obvious choice, but there's a whole chapter, an excellent chapter by Rosemary Foote in the handbook that is dedicated to China's perspective. And so I was looking at two other powers in the Asia-Pacific region that had initial tepid responses and still have a lot of reluctance, at least on the part of India, when it comes to R2P. But nevertheless, we've seen subtle changes in their policy that affirms this story of norm circulation rather than containment that I'm talking about in the chapter. In Japan's case, I looked at it because it is one of the major financial contributors to the UN, and particularly has a critical role in peace building. And in R2P world, we think of peace building as just another form of prevention. We know that one of the greatest risks of the future commission of atrocity crimes is the past history of that type of violence. And so peace building is integral to thinking about the implementation of R2P, and some of the best forms of sort of institutionalized and sustained prevention can come through a peace building agenda. Now, in that respect, Japan can be a critical actor, but when R2P first entered global discourse, it was quite a reluctant recipient of the R2P norms and ideas, partly because it was seen to compete with Japan's longstanding human security agenda. And in that respect, what the chapter walks through is this idea of how do we see changes that were occurring, not just in terms of the broadening of the R2P agenda to cohere better with Japan's foreign policy or international assistance interests and norms, but also changes that were occurring in Japan over the last decade that opened Japan to the full ambit of R2P implementation. The Peacebuilding Commission and R2P were both endorsed, or both, at the 2005 World Summit. And what the Peacebuilding Commission was doing was trying to integrate the political and security sides of peacebuilding with the economic and financial sides. Japan had a huge role in the implementation of the first iteration of the Peacebuilding Commission, and was the chair of the commission from 2007 to 2009. Its role in that, in the Peacebuilding Commission, necessarily had to think about integrated peacebuilding strategies, so the political and security sides of peacebuilding as well. So just as R2P is sort of opening, as Ban Ki-moon is opening the space for R2P to think more about this deeper agenda of capacity building, of international assistance, Japan is moving in a direction where we see greater engagement with political and security sides of peace building, security sector reform, demobilization, disarmament. And so I say the whole point being that there's this parallel process that isn't easily told just through containment. We also see changes that are happening on the part of Asia-Pacific actors that make them more open to R2P norms and ideas, or those ideas resonate better with security interests or international assistance priorities. In the case of India, India is perhaps the one where it seems self-evident because it has been such a strong opponent to, historically a strong opponent to humanitarian intervention, and was quite reluctant to endorse R2P in 2005. Now, what I look at in India's case is saying how there's been changes, and in India's aid policy in particular. There's a tendency to focus on India's peacekeeping policy, but in this chapter, I kind of look at where do we see changes in India's thinking a little bit that show us an impact or resonance of these norms in Indians' foreign policy behavior. And in that, I look at the emerging program of India in the field of international assistance in crisis situations, where historically, or traditionally, India has had a strong focus on bilateral aid to sovereign governments. And this is really problematic in crisis moments where state regimes can be the perpetrators of atrocity crimes. And I look at not only India's veering from that policy in 2009 in Sri Lanka, and for the first time channeling aid through international multilateral programs, but also how that program, or how that initial initiative carried forward after 2009, that India began to contribute to the Central Emergency Relief Fund, which is multilateral aid that allows India to veer from its policy that is so focused on sovereignty that can not deliver aid to governments, but can allow that aid to be delivered to suffering populations. And the argument that I make in the paper, or in the article, is that we cannot divorce these movements with the broader normative terrain of saying we're finding it less and less possible or permissible for governments to ignore norms of human protection in extreme atrocity situations, and, for example, to carry on delivering aid to governments that are carrying out this type of violence on their populations. So that's sort of the gist of the argument.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Finally, Alex, your chapter on the United Nations Security Council. You start off that chapter by saying that the R2P norm is the result of two particular types of failures that occurred in the 1990s. The first one, the failure over the 1994 Rwandan genocide and the ethnic cleansing occurring in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the second one, the failure of diplomacy over the 1999 Kosovo campaign. So I'd like to ask you to talk us through what these failures were and how these failures then resulted in the emergence of the responsibility to protect.
Sure. Well, they're failures of will and failures of consensus. So Rwanda and Bosnia are really all about failures of will. So the UN Security Council, confronted in the case of Rwanda by genocide that killed 800,000 people in 100 days, responded by actually reducing the size of the UN peacekeeping force there, simply because there was no will in the Council to take the action needed to stop the genocide. Nor was there will in the Council to prevent the genocide when the UN was informed prior to of a serious risk. Bosnia also is a failure of will. In Bosnia, you have the strange situation where you have the UN Security Council authorizing a peacekeeping mission called the United Nations Protection Force, that didn't actually have a mandate to protect civilians. So the only people who the protection force was mandated to protect was actually itself and humanitarian workers. So you had a situation where you had UN-designated safe areas overrun by Bosnian Serb militia, and the UN forces simply retreating and exposing the civilian population to massacres and other atrocity crimes. And of course, Srebrenica was the nadir, where 7,600 men and boys were taken from a UN-safe area and massacred. So there was a clear sense there that the UN was not fulfilling its responsibility, that there are expectations about what the UN ought to do. And a few years after those events, the UN did some major investigations into what happened and what went wrong and why. And both of those investigations came out with the conclusion that what happened in Rwanda and Bosnia was a systematic failure of the whole UN system. In fact, the UN member states, the Security Council, but also the UN institutions themselves had failed and needed to do better in the future. And at the time, the Secretary General Kofi Annan said nothing damages the United Nations more than its failure to respond to crimes such as genocide and mass atrocities. So then we fast forward 5 years, and we have Kosovo. And there you have a failure of consensus, which is where the Security Council failed to come to an agreement about the nature of the situation in Kosovo and the appropriate action. And as a result, NATO and some other states decided to go ahead and intervene without Council authorization. And this created a huge rupture inside the Council. Again, the Secretary General was caught somewhat in the middle, and he challenged the General Assembly, the UN membership as a whole, to resolve this dilemma, saying on the one hand, do we want a situation where we see genocide and mass atrocities and refuse to act? And if Rwanda was to happen again, if a group of states put their hand up and said, we'll go and stop it, would we really stop them from doing so and say, no, you shouldn't? But on the other hand, do we really want a situation where groups of powerful states can circumvent international law and the Security Council and intervene claiming a humanitarian mandate whenever they want? Clearly the answer is no, and some balance was needed. And it was taking on Annan's challenge to the General Assembly that Lloyd Axworthy, then Canadian Foreign Minister, called together this International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty to try and resolve this key tension coming out of Rwanda, Bosnia, and Kosovo, and that led the way to the development of the responsibility to protect idea.
Great. It's such an interesting story, right? The results of these particular failures translating into something that now has been officially endorsed and been around for 11 years. Now, within that R2P regime, it is recognized that the United Nations Security Council bears a special responsibility for protecting civilians against atrocity crimes. And as anyone who deals with R2P knows, atrocity crimes are defined as genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. I'd like to hear a little bit more about these particular special responsibilities and how the Council's thinking of its own role with regards to R2P has evolved over the last decade.
Sure. Well, the special responsibility is written quite clearly in paragraph 139 of the World Summit Outcome document. And there it says, when all else fails, when mass atrocities are being committed and we've tried political, humanitarian, other peaceful means and they've proven inadequate, then the Security Council should take timely and decisive action through chapters 6, 7, and 8 of the UN Charter. Now, chapter 6 relates to peaceful measures. Chapter 7 is the controversial chapter that relates to the use of coercive measures like force, economic sanctions, judicial sanctions. And chapter 8 relates to measures taken by regional arrangements. So the agreement on R2P is really quite clear in setting out that there are special responsibilities that the Security Council has. Now, it has those responsibilities precisely because it's the only body in the world authorized to mandate the use of coercive measures. It's the only body in the world that can actually authorize armed intervention, can legally impose sanctions, and all member states of the United Nations actually have an obligation under the UN Charter to carry out the decisions of the UN Security Council, so they're supposed to be legally binding. So the Council has this special role. Now, initially, in the early years, the Council was a little bit reticent about even recognizing its special role. So it took 6 months for the Council to pass a resolution simply reaffirming what had been agreed in the General Assembly, which shows how reticent the Council was. But nevertheless, they did that. And since then, they've reaffirmed the whole package of the responsibility to protect on 6 separate occasions. So over time, you see the Council getting more are more comfortable using the phrase and using the concept. You see that as well with, if we look at the period from 2005 to 2011, there the Council only used R2P in 6 resolutions, and they were hugely controversial. So one of those resolutions was a resolution on the crisis in Darfur, which many of you will know about, where 250,000 people were killed, 2.5 million forced from their homes. But again, it took months of painstaking negotiation to get a resolution on Darfur. One of the sticking points was the inclusion of the responsibility to protect in that. And so painful was those negotiations that some of the states advocating the responsibility to protect said, let's leave R2P out of resolutions in future, it just kind of gets in the way. But then we get to 2011 and we get this amazing turnaround where in the space of a few weeks, the Council responds robustly to emerging crises in Libya and Cote d'Ivoire, and suddenly the responsibility to protect language and the concept becomes mainstreamed into the Council's work. Now, since early 2011, despite the controversies, and of course the intervention in Libya was hugely controversial and caused all sorts of political pushback, but despite that, since then the Council has used R2P in more than 40 resolutions. Even on Libya, so Libya is hugely controversial. Even after the controversial resolution authorizing force, the Council has come back and in subsequent resolutions on Libya even has mentioned R2P. It's also used R2P in its resolutions on Syria, for example. And it's also started writing the responsibility to protect specifically into mandate. So it's moving beyond simply acknowledging the responsibility to protect or saying we recognize the state's primary responsibility to protect its own populations. And actually it started saying, you know what, peacekeepers in South Sudan and in Mali, they should assist in implementing the responsibility to protect. So we're seeing the Council gradually moving. First of all, becoming more comfortable using R2P. You talk to the Chinese or the Russians, they don't dispute that Syria, Libya is an R2P type situation. That's no longer debated and contested, whereas back in 2006-07, it would have been hotly debated and contested. Where the debates and contestations are now, when you look at, say, Syria, where there's blockage in the Council, is over the most appropriate course of action. So you don't find China sitting in the Council saying, Council shouldn't be involved, this isn't a matter for the international community. What you do see is China saying, we don't think this proposed course of action is the best way of delivering protection. Now that doesn't mean, of course, you're going to find the Council agreeing on everything, because member states bring all sorts of different considerations to the table, but it does shift the center of gravity and also shifts those expectations. And on Syria is a really good example because we've seen the Council being pushed by those global expectations. Council has to admit that there is a problem. It has to admit that it has to do something, even though 2 of its permanent members, particularly Russia, doesn't really want the Council to do anything. Even then, Russia has had to give ground. It had to, for example, allow through a resolution that authorized the delivery of humanitarian relief without the government's consent. First time the Council's ever done anything like that, and Russia did that to one of its allies. We've also seen the General Assembly sort of getting involved as well. The General Assembly telling the Council when it thinks the Council's not doing a good job in fulfilling its responsibility to protect. So again, on Syria, not only has the General Assembly passed resolutions endorsing some of the measures that were vetoed and blocked in the Council, we've seen the General Assembly actually pass a resolution deploring the Council's response to the crisis in Syria. So we've seen this sort of steady trajectory that often gets missed in a lot of literature because we focus on those kind of the hottest cases. We focus on the Libya and the Syria and fail to see all the other stuff that's going on, the South Sudans, the DRCs, the Yemens, the Central African Republics. When we look at the kind of daily work of the Council, we see R2P and protection more generally getting mainstreamed more fully into that work.
It's a really dynamic field. It's like the responsibility to protect with so many different dimensions, historical, contemporary, conceptual, empirical. It's going to be a big hit, I'm sure, for anyone who is unfamiliar with the responsibility to protect. That probably should be your starting point. And for those who are working in that field, this would be an essential reading at the same time. I want to thank the 3 of you for coming here. I want to congratulate you for producing this volume, and I want to thank you for tuning in. If you're interested in the book, you can find the link underneath this video. If you're interested in further research we're doing at the School of Political Science and International Studies here at UQ, you can also find our website posted underneath this video. Thank you, and see you next time.